Hello everybody and welcome to another Panelino Bambino video. In this video we're going to be talking about Fire Emblem Sacred Stones and specifically the choice promotions that exist in and throughout the game. So for those of you who don't know, in Sacred Stones, each class has two options when they promote, barring like your lords and stuff like that. So usually one of the classes is the same class that the class would promote into in Fire Emblem 6, Fire Emblem 7. So in this case we have a knight that can turn into a general. And then there's a new class. In this case, it's the Great Knight. Now, I want to just mention right off the bat, I love this. I think it's amazing that there are more classes in Sacred Stones, that you do have that option. However, we here on the channel, Panelino Bambino, tend to talk about Fire Emblem in sort of an objective way, in more of a min-max type way, right? Like I do tier lists, we always kind of are playing Iron Mans. And from an objective standpoint, when we're just looking at the classes and what you're giving up for different choices, most choices in this game, barring one, are not remotely close. So for this video, we're going to be talking about why these choices aren't close. I'm going to be giving little spiels on each individual promotion options, talking about what I think you should turn them into, and we'll kind of go over, as I said, why most of them don't work and one of them does work. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's analyze. Alright, so let's get started with, of course, the class that you see on your screen, and that is Knight. Now, before I get started, I just want to mention a few things. Number one, all the graphics I'm using here are just taken straight from serenusforest.net. If you don't know what that is, it's this amazing Fire Emblem resource. You can look at all the games, you can look at how to recruit characters, promotion games, what you get on maps, things of that nature. I'm assuming it's okay to be using their website, they're just graphics, but I apologize if it's not. But yeah, they're an amazing resource. I use them for most things. So I'm not sponsored or anything. I'll just get that out of the way. Additionally, I want to talk about things like max stats and promotion gains. I'm not going to be talking about any of that kind of stuff. Yes, there are slight differences in promotion gains depending on classes. And there's also different like max stats. But again, these things are just fairly minor when it comes to what you're actually getting out of the classes, and stuff like, you know, max stats are completely worthless for the purposes of an Iron Man. So we're not going to be talking about that kind of stuff. We're just going to be talking about what you get from the classes. And I'm also not going to be mentioning characters or anything like that. So let's get started. First, we have a knight. As I said, you can either become a general or a Great Knight. And this is really going to showcase one of the biggest reasons that most of these promotion options are not close. So in Fire Emblem, as you may or may not know, one of the best stats, or probably just the best stat, is movement. Movement is amazing. The ability to get objectives quick, to keep up with your army, to change from side to side. The list goes on and on. Movement is the best stat in basically every single Fire Emblem game. And one of the problems with most of these options is that you're giving up a movement for something that's quite a bit less useful. And that's what we're going to be seeing for all these right off the bat. So in general, they also, one of the things that they do in this game is they add some skills. So a few different classes have new skills that are supposed to kind of help them be unique and give you actual pause to make choices. So generals can have Great Shield, which is often called Pavice in a lot of other games. When procs, which I think the percentage might be equal to like your skills, something like that. But when it procs, you take no damage. Now, this is just inherently pretty worthless. Generals as a class already, kind of their whole thing is taking no to little damage. So the fact that every once in a while you take literally no damage is not that useful. But even if it was a more useful skill, again, Great Knight gets a whole additional movement. That's just so useful. So Knights should always become Great Knights. There's no reason to become a general ever. One of the other problems with a lot of these classes we're going to be seeing is something that either is not helping things. They're not sort of helping with the problems with classes. So generals' problems are not defense, right? So Great Shield's not useful. The problem is movement. And Great Knight helps with that movement. So as I said, always turn Knight into Great Knight. Next up we have Cavalier, which is going to see a similar issue. So this is another problem. The ability to use an additional weapon sometimes is pretty useful, but a lot of times isn't. So in this case, it's not. Now, there are certain cases, one specifically that I'll be talking about in a little bit, where the ability to go from, let's say, a sword, which is pretty weak, to a two-range weapon, like a lance or an axe, is really useful. But the difference between a lance and an axe is just not that relevant. right? Either way, you can use 1-2 range in the form of generals or hand axes. Or javelins and hand axes. Sorry, you're not throwing generals, although that would be interesting. There are, along with movement, there's one other thing that's really important in GBA games, and that's 1-2 range. And this can be achieved through basically all offensive magics, or lances and axes. But there's really not a huge difference between an axe and a lance. Hand axe and javelins are both amazing. Additionally, and this is of course the big thing, paladins have 2 additional movement as opposed to a Great Knight. That's just insane. That you wouldn't give up something that's, as I just explained, pretty minor for 2 additional movement, or even 1 additional movement. So always paladin, always, always, always. Alright, scrolling down, we have Archer. So Archer is maybe the worst in the whole game as far as like which one you should pick. So they can either become a sniper, which is just an awful class. They do get the skill Sure Strike. So Sure Strike, when procced, allows you to hit your target. If that sounds pointless, it's because it is. Archers hit their target no matter what. I mean, that's our whole thing, right? Bows have good hit rates, and your archers tend to have high skill. Also, this isn't Fire Emblem 6, so stuff doesn't miss all the time. So Sure Strike's just a useless ability, or at least fairly useless. Now, the other option gives you all the things that I just mentioned. So archers are bow locked, which means they're locked to 2 range, but rangers allow you to use 1 range, so that's useful in and of itself. They also give you that nice 8 movement. It's basically a nomad trooper, which fixes another problem with archers, which is the inability to have high movement. So always, always, always ranger. It's way, way better. Now the next choice is basically the closest choice in the whole game. And there's a very specific reason for this, and a very specific reason that this wouldn't work for any other class in the whole game. So mercenaries can either become rangers or heroes. Now, I mentioned earlier how there are basically 2 things that you're looking for to get with your class. As much movement as possible, and the ability to use some kind of 1-2 range. Now, Archer shares this same thing, but mercenaries don't have either of these, right? And so, if you split their class between one unit, in the case of Ranger, which fixes the movement problem, getting 8 movement, and the other class, in the case of Hero, which fixes the 1-2 range issue, in the case of getting the axes, there's a legitimate choice to be made here. Now, Rangers, of course, can also use bows, which technically are 1-2 range when combined with swords, well, there's a big difference between switching between swords and bows and just being able to use a hand axe. But this is the one promotion option in the game that genuinely gives you a choice because you split movement and 1-2 range. If, let's say, Archer had Ranger as opposed to somebody that could use axes and bows, well, it would essentially be the same choice, but it would be genuinely interesting. Now, again, this is basically the only choice that's close in the whole game, and the reason that this works whereas nothing else does is because most other classes don't have both issues that a mercenary has. For example, going down to fighter, you couldn't really have this be close because you could have one fixing the movement, but the other one would also fix movement, I guess. Like, there's no other thing that you could juxtapose movement with to make it interesting. So speaking of fighter, let's talk about fighter. This is another thing that I'm going to be talking about with some classes. Some classes are so close, it's pointless. So should you turn them into a hero or warrior, it doesn't really matter. Swords and bows are both pretty useless as far as weapons are concerned when you can already use axes. Bows, I think the fact that they have effective damage some of the time probably make them more useful. So I'd probably go with warrior here. But again, you can already use axes. So this is a pretty whatever promotion. I tend to turn them into heroes just because even though I did say I wouldn't mention promotion gains, I think you do get more speed when you promote to a hero. So when you have stuff that's this minor and this close, sometimes you can factor that in. But again, this is pretty irrelevant here. Next up, we have a legitimately very one-sided choice in the case of Pirate. So Pirate can either become Warrior or Berserker. Now, as I said before, the fact that Berserker doesn't get to use bows, essentially worthless. You can already use hand axes. You don't need bows for anything. Berserker has 2 things that make them really strong as well. Critical bonus, they just have 30% base 30 crit or something, which is awesome, obviously. And they can walk on water, which there are a few times throughout the game that's actually fairly useful. So always Berserker, always, always, always Berserker. Next up, we have Myrmidon, which can either become a Swordmaster or an Assassin. This is another one that's just so close and pointless that it doesn't really matter. Same thing with Thief, Assassin, and Rogue. So Swordmasters have like base 30 crit, kind of like the Berserker. Assassins have the skill Silencer, which when it procs just insta-kills the enemy, which is kind of cool. And Rogues don't have to use a lockpick in order to open up chests. Now the problem is, again, none of these classes are fixing any of the core problems with Myrmidon or Thief, which is being sword locked. They don't fix the movement, and they don't fix the inability to have 1-2 range. So they're all pretty useless. I would probably say turn Thief into an Assassin because there's not that many things to open, so having to use a lockpick on the Assassin as opposed to not with the Rogue isn't that relevant, and Silencer is pretty nice. And with the Myrmidon, I'd probably turn him into Swordmaster. You just have, like, crits will usually kill anyways, so you don't need the Silencer skill. So I think you have a higher chance to crit than proc the Silencer skill. But again, it's pretty minor and irrelevant with these. You can turn them into whatever you want. You honestly just shouldn't be training them in the first place. But if you want to, they're pretty relevant. Okay, so this next one, I'm going to lump all these in together because they're all kind of the same. Pegasus Knights can become Falcon Knights or Wyvern Knights. Wyvern Riders, same thing with Wyvern Knight, except for Wyvern Lord. Now, Wyvern Lord and Falcon Knight, they have no additional skills or anything. They can both just use swords. But as I mentioned before, being able to use an additional weapon when it's something as worthless as a sword, when you can already use javelins, is just not that relevant. Wyvern Knight, however, does give you the skill Pierce. Now, Pierce, when it procs, disregards the opponent's defense. This is actually pretty relevant. It just gives you additional crit, basically, or at least occasionally you'll just deal additional damage. Which again is just way more useful. The ability to shove an iron sword on, Cormag or Tana or whatever, it won't be that relevant basically any of the time. Whereas the ability to occasionally just deal a little bit more damage is actually very relevant, especially considering how much combat these classes tend to see because they already have the high movement. So always Wyvern Knight for both of these classes 100%. Okay, next up we're going to have a little bit of nothing. The Troubadour can either become a Mage Knight or a Valkyrie. This is fairly irrelevant. Let me go up a little bit so you can see it. Either way, you're getting additional movement. The difference is between Anima Magic and Light Magic, but again, like, Troubadours are mostly going to be healing, so the offensive magic you get isn't that relevant. I would go with Anima Magic just because fire is stronger than lightning, but this is fairly irrelevant. You can turn them into whatever you want. I personally like Valkyrie, just think it's cool, but... Next up, we have Cleric. Now, the Bishop class is actually really, really nice, and I'll talk about it more with the Priest and the Monk. The Slayer skill is actually really good, but in this case, having the additional movement, especially on a class that's not going to be as offensively capable as a Cleric, is way better. You want to turn your Cleric into Valkyrie every single time. Now, this doesn't mean that Bishop is a bad class, because it really isn't. So this is another example of trading one thing that's fairly useful for another thing that's almost useless. The Slayer skill allows you to deal effective damage against monsters. Now, a lot of the enemies you're going to be fighting throughout the Sacred Stones aren't monsters, but there are some monsters and monster-only chapters, especially late in the game. So Slayer actually has a lot of utility. It can be really, really useful. Sage, on the other hand, gives you the ability to use Anima Magic. If you're Anima Magic if you're a priest. If you're a monk. But it allows you to use both. And again, this just isn't that relevant. Yes, Anima Magic, when you aren't proccing the Slayer skill, is slightly better than Light Magic. But in the case of, like, the Monk, for example, you're only going to be able to use low-level Anima Magic, so it's irrelevant. In the case of the Priest, the slight offensive boost you're going to be getting, you may as well get the Slayer skill, because that's the only time it's going to be useful. So there's no reason to ever do Sage, actually in the game in general, and I'll talk about that more with the Mage, but in the case of these two characters, always Bishop, the Slayer skill is actually quite useful. And if your Priest never sees combat, then it doesn't matter what you turn him into. So next up we have Mage, as I just mentioned. You can either become a Mage Knight or a Sage. This is another great example of trading the ability to use an additional weapon, or in this case an additional magic type in Light Magic, with movement. And as we've explained before, movement is amazing, and the ability to use a weaker magic class at a lower level than you were at the time you turned into a mage is just irrelevant. I know that there are some other things like weapon level. I think sages come with better staff rank than mage knights, I think. So maybe there's some utility there, but again, this is pretty minor stuff, and I'm not going to factor that in too much. So with mage, always mage knight. Additional movement is just way more useful. And finally, we have Shaman, another very lopsided thing. So Shammoner, that's not a class. Summoner is a new class just for this game, and has, of course, the skill Summon. So you can summon these, like, little their level is equal to your level phantoms, and they always have 1 health. Now, if you know anything about summoning, it's very rare in Fire Emblem games. You know, like Tanith's reinforcement skill in Path of Radiance is awesome. You can very rarely do it, and it's always busted when you can do it. So it would be really hard, unless the Druid gave you, like, a bunch of movement, to find a better promotion than the Summoner. And the only thing that the druid does differently is give you the ability to use animal magic. And as we just explained, the ability to use a crappy magic type is just not that relevant. Additionally, and again, I'm not going to factor in characters, this doesn't matter, but the only shaman you should ever really be promoting is Noel, and his offensive magic sucks, so basically the only thing you're ever getting is the stabs and the summon. Alright, and finally, as always, I just want to thank everybody for watching. This has been a topic that I've always found really interesting. You know, as I said at the start of the video, I love the ability to choose your promotions, even though, again, objectively, basically none of them makes sense, I guess you could say. You know, when I was a kid, I would still turn, I always felt it was right to turn like Ford into a Great Knight, for example, because it made sense for the character. Objectively, that doesn't make any sense, but I understand that most people playing Fire Emblem don't play it in the same way that I do, or in the same way that this channel is built on doing. And so I'm not saying that this mechanic and the ability to promote different things is bad or dumb. I absolutely love it. I'm with all of you. But from an objective standpoint, I just wanted to explain why basically none of these options are actually close. So as always, if you have any comments, concerns, anything I missed, feel free to comment. You know, I'll always reply. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.